Dr. James Harrison stopped mid-sentence, his pen frozen halfway to the clipboard, staring at the grotesquely swollen foot before him. In 30 years of emergency medicine, he had never seen anything like this. What should have been a routine case of elderly edema had transformed into something that defied every textbook he'd ever studied. The purplish-black discoloration spiraled up Margaret Thompson's leg like spilled ink on parchment. Nurse Patricia O'Brien gasped audibly, her coffee cup clattering to the floor as she backed away from the examination table. The sterile hospital air suddenly felt thick with an unspoken dread that made seasoned medical professionals exchange worried glances. Margaret, 78 and alone, watched their faces transform from professional confidence to barely concealed alarm. She remembered her late husband Frank's final days, how doctors had worn those same expressions of helpless confusion. "Get doctor." "Martinez in here now," Harrison commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. What had started as a simple Florida vacation souvenir would soon reveal a medical mystery that would shake this hospital to its core. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 weeks earlier, Margaret Thompson had stood in her empty Cleveland kitchen, staring at the airline ticket that represented her first vacation in 8 years. The modest ranch house felt suffocatingly quiet since Frank's passing, filled only with the tick of his old grandfather clock and the distant hum of Mrs. Rodriguez's television next door. At 78, Margaret had learned that silence could be louder than any scream. She was what people politely called well-preserved. Silver hair always perfectly set, lipstick applied even for grocery runs, and a posture that spoke of decades teaching ballroom dance to starry-eyed couples. But behind her carefully maintained facade lived a woman drowning in loneliness, surviving on Social Security checks that barely covered her medications, too proud to burden her successful children with her struggles. Sarah Thompson Williams, her daughter, lived in a glass tower in Chicago, crafting corporate deals worth millions, while her own life crumbled around her recent divorce. At 45, Sarah had mastered every courtroom but couldn't master a simple phone call to her mother. Their conversations had become perfunctory exchanges: weather, health, work, dancing around the elephant of Frank's absence and Margaret's increasing isolation. Michael, her son, represented everything Margaret admired about honest work. At 42, he ran a small auto repair shop in Detroit, his hands permanently stained with grease, his heart permanently stained with guilt over not visiting enough. 3 children and a struggling business left little time for an aging mother who insisted she was doing just fine, thank you very much. The Florida trip had been Michael's idea, a peace offering wrapped in airline miles he'd been saving for years. "Come see the grandkids, Ma. They barely remember what you look like." His words had stung with unintended truth. Little Emma was now 7, born 3 months after Frank's funeral. Tommy, 9, still asked when Grandpa Frank was coming back. And baby Jake, barely 3, knew Margaret only through pixelated video calls. Margaret's house told the story of a life well lived but increasingly forgotten. Frank's coffee mug still sat beside the kitchen sink, waiting for a morning that would never come. His reading glasses remained on the nightstand, forever marking his place in a mystery novel he'd never finish. The refrigerator displayed a gallery of school photos and crayon drawings from grandchildren who lived 800 miles away and might as well have lived on the moon. She had taught dance for 43 years, guiding couples through their first waltz, their wedding dance, their anniversary celebrations. Now her own feet ached with arthritis, and the ballroom shoes that once glided across polished floors gathered dust in her closet. The woman who had made magic happen with music and movement now struggled to find rhythm in her own solitary days. But that Florida ticket represented hope, a chance to matter again, to be grandma instead of just Margaret, to feel useful in a world that seemed increasingly designed for younger hands and sharper minds. The Tampa heat hit Margaret like a warm embrace as she stepped off the plane, her arthritic joints already feeling looser in the humid Florida air. Michael waited at the gate with 7-year-old Emma bouncing beside him, her gap-toothed grin infectious. "Grandma Maggie!" she squealed, launching herself into Margaret's arms with the fearless abandon that only children possess. For the first time in months, Margaret felt truly alive. The rental house Michael had chosen sat in a quiet suburb where palm trees swayed like dancers, and the air smelled of jasmine and possibility. Baby Jake, now walking and babbling in his own mysterious language, toddled toward her with chubby arms outstretched. 9-year-old Tommy, suddenly shy, hung back until Margaret produced the baseball cards she'd been collecting for him all year. "Ma, you didn't have to," Michael said. But his eyes crinkled with the same joy she remembered from his childhood Christmases. His wife Linda bustled around the kitchen, preparing what she called a proper feast for Grandma, and Margaret marveled at how easily she slipped back into being needed, being wanted, being part of something larger than her empty Cleveland house. The days blurred together in the most wonderful way. She taught Emma to braid friendship bracelets, the same way she'd taught Sarah decades ago. She listened to Tommy's elaborate stories about school friends and playground adventures, remembering when Michael had spun similar tales. She rocked Jake during his afternoon naps, humming lullabies that Frank used to sing. On the third day, Michael suggested they work in the backyard garden together. The previous owners had left raised beds filled with herbs and vegetables, and Margaret found herself kneeling in the rich, dark soil, her hands remembering the rhythm of planting and weeding from her own long-abandoned garden. The Florida sun felt healing on her shoulders as she worked alongside her grandchildren, teaching them the difference between weeds and seedlings. "Grandma, look what I found." Emma held up a rusty garden tool, its metal surface pitted with age and corrosion. Margaret barely glanced at it, focused instead on showing Tommy how to properly space tomato plants. In her contentment, she didn't notice the jagged edge as she took the tool from Emma's small hands, didn't feel the slight scrape against her ankle as she leaned forward to demonstrate proper digging technique. The scratch was so minor she forgot about it immediately, caught up in Jake's delighted laughter as he threw handfuls of soil in the air like confetti. This was what she had been missing, the chaos and joy of family life, the sense that her presence mattered, that her stories and wisdom still had value. That evening, as they sat on the back porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Margaret felt more like herself than she had since Frank's death. Linda had made her grandmother's pound cake recipe, and the children sat at her feet as she told them stories about their daddy when he was their age. Michael's hand rested on her shoulder, and she could feel years of guilt and distance melting away in the warm night air. "I wish you could stay forever, Grandma," Emma whispered as Margaret tucked her into bed, and Margaret's heart clenched with the bittersweet ache of knowing this perfect week had to end. The flight home felt different from the journey there. Her ankle throbbed slightly, probably just the pressure changes that came with flying at her age. She'd noticed some swelling during the drive to the airport, but attributed it to all the unaccustomed activity. At 78, every adventure came with its small physical prices. As the plane lifted off from Tampa, Margaret pressed her face to the window and watched Michael's borrowed life shrink below her. The week had been a gift, but now reality waited in Cleveland. The empty house, the silence, the slow march of days that all looked the same. She closed her eyes and tried to hold on to the feeling of Emma's arms around her neck, Tommy's excited chatter, Jake's slobbery kisses. By the time they reached cruising altitude, her ankle had swollen noticeably, straining against her sensible travel shoes. The elderly woman beside her noticed Margaret shifting uncomfortably and offered a sympathetic smile. Flying's hard on the circulation at our age, isn't it, dear? Margaret nodded, grateful for the simple explanation. She elevated her foot as much as the cramped airline seat would allow and tried to focus on the memories she was carrying home instead of the growing discomfort. When the plane touched down in Cleveland, Margaret could barely squeeze her foot back into her shoe, but she was home, carrying with her a week's worth of joy and the renewed certainty that family love, however distant, never truly disappeared. She had no way of knowing that something else had made the journey with her, something that would soon transform her quiet life into a fight for survival. Margaret woke on her first morning back in Cleveland to find her left foot had transformed into something unrecognizable. What had been mild airplane swelling the night before now resembled a grotesque balloon, her skin stretched tight and shiny, the color of old bruises. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at this alien appendage that barely looked human, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "It's just the flight," she whispered to Frank's empty side of the bed, her voice echoing in the morning silence. "Remember when your feet used to swell after those long drives to see your sister?" But even as she spoke the words, she knew this was different. This was something that lived in the realm of nightmares, not normal aging complaints. She managed to shuffle to the bathroom, each step sending lightning bolts of pain shooting up her leg. In the harsh, fluorescent light, her foot looked even worse, mottled purple and white, the skin so tight it looked ready to split. She ran cool water in the bathtub and soaked her foot, hoping the simple remedy that had worked for Frank's minor swelling might work some magic here. By afternoon, the pain had evolved from uncomfortable to unbearable. Margaret found herself crawling from room to room, too proud to call for help, but too honest to pretend this was normal. She tried ice packs, elevation, every home remedy she could remember from decades of caring for Frank's various ailments. Nothing touched the relentless throbbing that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. The phone rang 3 times that day. Sarah calling from Chicago between meetings, her voice rushed and distracted. "How was Florida, Mom? I'm sorry, I can't talk long. I'm due in court in 20 minutes. Margaret almost told her about the foot, almost asked for help, but Sarah's hurried tone stopped her. Her daughter had important things to do, people depending on her. Margaret's swollen foot seemed trivial in comparison to corporate mergers and legal battles. That evening, unable to bear weight on her foot at all, Margaret made a decision that went against every fiber of her independent nature. She called Mrs. Rodriguez next door, her voice carefully controlled to hide her desperation. "Elena, I'm sorry to bother you, but I seem to have hurt my foot somehow. Would you mind taking a look?" Elena Rodriguez had been a nurse before retirement, and Margaret watched her neighbor's face transform from casual concern to barely concealed alarm as she examined the swollen appendage. "Margaret, mija, this is not good. When did this start?" "Yesterday, after the flight from Florida. It's probably just—" "No." Elena's voice was firm, professional. "This is not airplane swelling. Look at these red streaks." She traced lines that Margaret hadn't noticed, angry red tendrils creeping up her leg like poisonous vines. "These are going up toward your knee. And your foot. It's so hot, I can feel it through the skin." Margaret stared at the red lines, her breath catching. Frank had developed something similar during his final hospital stay. The doctors had called it blood poisoning, used words like sepsis and infection while she sat helplessly by his bedside. "But I feel fine otherwise. Just tired." Elena's experienced hands found Margaret's pulse, her frown deepening. "Your heart is racing and you're running a fever. When did you last eat?" Margaret couldn't remember. The thought of food had made her nauseous all day. "Margaret, listen to me carefully. This is serious. You need to go to the hospital now." "I can't afford another hospital bill." The words escaped before Margaret could stop them, revealing the fear that lurked beneath her stoic exterior. And Frank's final illness had cost them nearly everything, and she was still paying off the remnants on a payment plan that stretched her Social Security to its breaking point. "This is not about money," Elena said, gently but firmly. "This is about your life. If these red lines reach your heart—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. She had been a caregiver long enough to recognize when someone was trying to spare her feelings while delivering devastating news. The drive to Cleveland General felt surreal. Margaret's throbbing foot propped awkwardly in Elena's passenger seat while familiar neighborhoods blurred past the window. She found herself thinking about Frank's last ride in an ambulance. How small and frightened he had looked surrounded by all those machines. She had promised herself then that she would never be a burden to anyone, would never put her children through that helpless vigil of watching a parent suffer. "Should I call Sarah and Michael?" Elena asked as they pulled into the hospital parking lot, and Margaret's immediate instinct was to say no. Sarah had court cases to win, Michael had a business to run and children to raise. They didn't need their aging mother disrupting their lives with medical emergencies that were probably nothing more than an old woman's overreaction to a minor problem. But looking down at her foot, now visibly pulsing with each heartbeat and radiating heat like a furnace, Margaret felt the first real stirrings of fear. The red streaks had advanced noticeably even during the short car ride, creeping up her calf with a malevolent persistence that spoke of something far more serious than airplane swelling. "Maybe," she whispered, the word feeling like surrender. "Maybe you should call them." As Elena helped her into a wheelchair at the emergency room entrance, Margaret caught her reflection in the glass doors. A frightened old woman with wild gray hair and pain-glazed eyes, clutching the arms of a hospital wheelchair like it was her last anchor to the world. She looked exactly like the people she had always pitied, the ones who ended up alone in hospital corridors with nothing but their fear for company. The automatic doors whooshed open, welcoming her into the harsh, fluorescent world of medical crisis, and Margaret Thompson began the journey that would either save her life or cost her everything she had left to lose. The emergency room at Cleveland General buzzed with the familiar chaos of human suffering, crying children, anxious families huddled in uncomfortable chairs, and the constant shuffle of medical personnel moving between crises. Margaret found herself relegated to a corner wheelchair, her grotesquely swollen foot hidden beneath a thin hospital blanket, watching other patients get called back while her pain intensified with each passing hour. "Mrs. Thompson?" A young resident with tired eyes and coffee stains on his scrubs finally called her name. She had been waiting for 3 hours, watching the red streaks on her leg advance like a slow-motion invasion, each pulse bringing them closer to her knee. "I'm Dr. Kumar. Let's take a look at what's going on." The examination room felt sterile and cold, nothing like the warm Florida garden where this nightmare had begun. As Dr. Kumar unwrapped her foot, Margaret watched his expression shift from routine professionalism to something approaching alarm. He called for Dr. Harrison almost immediately, and Margaret's stomach dropped as she recognized the urgent undertone in his voice. When Dr. James Harrison entered the room, Margaret saw 30 years of emergency medicine written in the lines around his eyes. He was the kind of doctor who had seen everything, handled every crisis with steady hands and measured words. But as he examined her foot, she watched his professional composure crack slightly around the edges. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you," Harrison said, his voice gentle but serious. "This isn't just swelling from your flight. We're looking at what appears to be a severe infection, possibly blood poisoning. I need to run some tests immediately, and I need to ask you some questions about your recent travels." The questions came in a rush. Where had she been? What had she done? Had she noticed any cuts or scrapes? Margaret's mind felt foggy with pain and medication, but she tried to remember everything about her Florida trip. The garden, the children, the rusty tool Emma had found. It all seemed so innocent, so far removed from this sterile hospital room where machines beeped ominously and her foot looked like something from a medical textbook's horror stories. "We need to contact your family," Dr. Harrison said after reviewing her blood work, and Margaret's heart sank. The numbers on the lab report meant nothing to her, but she could read the concern in his face like a roadmap to disaster. "Your white blood cell count is dangerously high and your blood pressure is dropping. We need to start aggressive treatment immediately." Elena had already called Sarah, who was boarding a red-eye flight from Chicago, her voice tight with panic during their brief phone conversation. "Mom, why didn't you call me yesterday? Why did you wait so long?" The guilt in Sarah's questions cut deeper than any physical pain Margaret was experiencing. Michael was driving through the night from Detroit, his wife Linda watching the children while he raced toward a crisis none of them had seen coming. The next 18 hours blurred together in a haze of IV antibiotics, blood draws every few hours, and increasingly worried consultations between doctors who spoke in medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language. Margaret's room filled with flowers from Elena and cards from her former dance students, but her family was what she desperately needed. Sarah arrived looking like she had aged 5 years overnight, still wearing her court clothes but with her usually perfect hair disheveled and her makeup smudged from crying on the airplane. She took one look at Margaret's foot and had to excuse herself to the bathroom, emerging minutes later with red-rimmed eyes and a determined expression that Margaret recognized from Sarah's childhood, the look she got when facing something that scared her. "What are the doctors saying exactly?" Sarah demanded, pulling out a legal pad and pen as if she could cross-examine Margaret's illness into submission. "I need to understand the treatment plan, the prognosis, the options. I need to know what we're dealing with." Michael arrived 6 hours later, his work clothes wrinkled from the long drive, his face etched with the same helpless expression he'd worn as a boy when his pet hamster had died. He sat beside Margaret's bed and held her hand without saying anything, his calloused fingers gentle against her paper-thin skin. Sometimes, Margaret thought, silence spoke louder than any words. The family dynamics that had been dormant for years suddenly erupted under the stress of potential loss. Sarah wanted to transfer Margaret to a specialist in Chicago, convinced that Cleveland General wasn't equipped for whatever mysterious ailment their mother had contracted. Michael argued for keeping her close to home, surrounded by familiar faces and the community that had rallied around her since Frank's death. "She's not a legal case, Sarah," Michael said during one of their heated discussions in the hospital corridor. "She's our mother, and she needs to feel safe, not shuffled around like a corporate asset. And she's not one of your broken-down cars that you can fix with spare parts and good intentions," Sarah shot back, her lawyer's training making her words precise and cutting. "She needs the best medical care available, not sentimental attachment to a second-rate hospital." Margaret listened to their arguments through her hospital room door, her heart breaking at how easily her children had fallen back into the adversarial roles that had defined their relationship since childhood. Sarah the achiever, always pushing for more, better, perfect. Michael the steady one, loyal to his roots and suspicious of anything that smacked of showing off. Dr. Harrison gathered the family for a conference on the third day, his expression more troubled than Margaret had yet seen. "We've been treating Mrs. Thompson aggressively for what we initially thought was cellulitis, but her condition isn't responding as we'd hoped. The infection appears to be resistant to our standard antibiotics, and it's continuing to spread." He pulled up images on his computer screen, cross-sections of Margaret's leg that looked like abstract art, painted in shades of inflammation and decay. "We're dealing with something unusual here. The bacterial culture came back showing multiple organisms, some of which we don't commonly see in typical wound infections. It's as if she was exposed to something particularly virulent. Sarah fired questions like bullets. What were the treatment options? What was the mortality rate? Should they be considering amputation? Michael sat quietly, holding Margaret's hand and occasionally wiping away tears he thought no one else noticed. Margaret felt like she was watching her own life being discussed as a medical curiosity, her children negotiating with death itself over her hospital bed. The turning point came when Dr. Harrison admitted something that chilled them all. In 30 years of emergency medicine, I've never encountered an infection quite like this. We've consulted with infectious disease specialists, sent samples to the CDC, and we're still not entirely sure what we're dealing with. Margaret's room became a revolving door of specialists, infectious disease experts who spoke in hushed tones about unusual bacterial strains, vascular surgeons who examined her leg with increasingly worried expressions, and social workers who gently broached topics like advance directives and end-of-life preferences. Each consultation felt like another step closer to an abyss that Margaret wasn't ready to face. The community response surprised everyone. Margaret's former dance students organized a prayer vigil at the hospital chapel. Her neighbors brought meals for Sarah and Michael, who had barely left the hospital since arriving. The local newspaper picked up the story of the mysterious illness that had struck a beloved dance teacher. And suddenly, Margaret's room was filled with cards and flowers from people she hadn't seen in years. But beneath the outpouring of love and support, a darker current ran through the family conversations. The medical bills were mounting exponentially, and Margaret's modest insurance coverage wasn't designed for the kind of intensive treatment she needed. Sarah quietly arranged to cover the expenses, but Margaret overheard enough whispered phone conversations to understand the financial strain her illness was creating. On the fourth night, as Margaret lay awake listening to the hospital's nocturnal symphony of beeping machines and hushed conversations, she felt something shift inside her. The pain in her foot had become a constant companion, but what frightened her more was the growing numbness that crept up her leg like a slow tide. She pressed the call button with trembling fingers, knowing that whatever came next would change everything for her and the children she had tried so hard not to burden. The night nurse who responded to her call took one look at Margaret's leg and immediately paged Dr. Harrison, her usual professional calm, cracking just enough for Margaret to see the fear underneath. As medical personnel flooded her room at 3 in the morning, Margaret closed her eyes and thought about Florida sunshine, Emma's gap-toothed smile, and the rusty garden tool that had started this nightmare. She wondered if she would ever see her grandchildren again. The alarm that pierced the pre-dawn silence of Cleveland General sent ice through Margaret's veins. Her heart monitor had flatlined for 7 agonizing seconds before jolting back to an erratic rhythm that made the machines around her bed scream their electronic warnings. Dr. Harrison burst through the door, still wearing yesterday's scrubs, his hair disheveled from catching whatever sleep he could manage in the on-call room. "Get me a crash cart in here now," he shouted, his hands already working to stabilize Margaret's failing vital signs. The infection had reached a tipping point, racing through her bloodstream with a malevolent determination that defied every antibiotic they had thrown at it. Her blood pressure plummeted while her temperature spiked to dangerous heights, creating a perfect storm of septic shock that threatened to shut down her organs one by one. Sarah and Michael materialized at her bedside within minutes, their faces pale with terror as they watched a team of medical professionals fight for their mother's life. Margaret's consciousness flickered in and out like a faulty light bulb, catching fragments of urgent conversations about experimental treatments and last resort procedures. "We need to take her to surgery immediately," Dr. Harrison announced, his voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. "The infection has progressed to necrotizing fasciitis, flesh-eating bacteria. If we don't perform aggressive debridement right now, she won't survive the next few hours." The words hit the family like physical blows. Flesh-eating bacteria sounded like something from a horror movie, not something that could attack a grandmother who had been gardening with her grandchildren just days ago. Sarah's legal training kicked in automatically, demanding explanations and second opinions, while Michael stood frozen in shock, his face the color of hospital linens. "How is this possible?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "She was fine a week ago. She was playing with my children, teaching them to braid friendship bracelets. How does someone go from that to this?" Dr. Harrison's explanation came in rapid-fire medical terminology that sounded like a foreign language. The bacteria had likely entered through the minor scratch from the rusty garden tool, finding Margaret's aging immune system unable to mount an effective defense. What should have been a minor wound had become a gateway for organisms that thrived in contaminated soil, possibly from old medical waste or agricultural runoff that had seeped into Florida's groundwater over decades. The consent forms felt like signing Margaret's death warrant. Aggressive surgical debridement meant cutting away all infected tissue, potentially including significant portions of her leg. There was no guarantee the surgery would work, no promise that Margaret would survive the procedure, and even less certainty about what kind of life she would have if she did. "Mom, we need to know what you want," Sarah whispered, leaning close to Margaret's ear during a brief moment of consciousness. "The doctors need permission to operate, but they can't promise, they can't guarantee." Her voice broke completely, years of professional composure crumbling in the face of potentially losing the woman who had raised her. Margaret's response was barely audible, her voice rough from days of breathing treatments and oxygen masks. "I want to see my grandchildren grow up," she whispered. "Do whatever you have to do." The surgical suite felt like a cathedral of medical technology, sterile and imposing in its life-and-death gravity. Margaret's last coherent thought before the anesthesia took hold was of Emma's delighted laughter in the Florida garden, the sound of pure joy that had made her feel useful and loved in a way she hadn't experienced since Frank's death. For 6 hours, Sarah and Michael kept vigil in the surgical waiting room, a sterile purgatory where hope and despair battled for dominance with each passing minute. Other families came and went, their own medical crises playing out in hushed conversations and tear-stained faces, but Sarah and Michael remained locked in their own private hell of waiting and wondering. The community response during those crucial hours was overwhelming. Margaret's former dance students organized a prayer chain that stretched across 3 states. Elena Rodriguez brought homemade soup that no one could eat, her presence a comforting reminder that Margaret was loved beyond her immediate family. The hospital chapel filled with people who hadn't seen Margaret in years but remembered her kindness, her patience with clumsy dancers, her ability to make everyone feel graceful under her instruction. Local news crews arrived, drawn by the unusual nature of Margaret's case and the community rally that had formed around her. The story of the beloved dance teacher battling a mysterious infection touched something deep in people's hearts, perhaps because it reminded them of their own aging parents, their own mortality, their own fears of facing crisis alone. Dr. Harrison emerged from surgery looking like he had aged a decade in 6 hours. His scrubs were soaked with perspiration, his hands still trembling slightly from the intensity of the procedure. The family could read nothing in his exhausted expression as he pulled off his surgical cap and ran his hands through his gray hair. "We removed approximately 30% of the infected tissue," he began, his voice hoarse from hours of barked instructions and intense concentration. "The bacteria had spread further than our imaging showed, but we were able to get ahead of it before it reached her femoral artery. She's alive, but the next 48 hours will be critical." The relief Sarah and Michael felt was tempered by the harsh reality of what their mother faced. Even if she survived the immediate crisis, Margaret would require months of rehabilitation, possible additional surgeries, and a complete restructuring of her independent lifestyle. The woman who had been too proud to ask for help with grocery shopping would now need assistance with the most basic activities of daily living. Margaret's first words when she regained consciousness were typical of her selfless nature. "Did I miss Thanksgiving?" The question, delivered through an oxygen mask in a voice weak from trauma, made both her children laugh and cry simultaneously. It was so perfectly Margaret, worried about disappointing others even while fighting for her own life. The intensive care unit became the family's temporary home, with Sarah and Michael taking shifts so Margaret was never alone. They learned the rhythms of hospital life, the shift changes, the medication schedules, the small victories measured in stable vital signs and decreased pain levels. Sarah worked from Margaret's bedside, her laptop balanced on a rolling table while she negotiated contracts between doctor visits. Michael called his shop every few hours, his employees covering for him while he held his mother's hand and told her stories about his children's latest adventures. The breakthrough came on the third day post-surgery, when Margaret's fever finally broke and her white blood cell count began trending downward. Dr. Harrison cautiously used the word optimistic for the first time since her admission, though he was careful to manage expectations about her long-term recovery. But the real turning point wasn't medical, it was emotional. As Margaret grew stronger, she began sharing memories of her week in Florida with a clarity that surprised everyone. She talked about teaching Emma to braid bracelets, about Tommy's elaborate stories, about Jake's delighted squeals as he threw dirt in the garden. The joy in her voice when she spoke about her grandchildren was unmistakable, a reminder of what she was fighting to return to. The financial reality of Margaret's care loomed large over every conversation. Even with insurance, the costs were staggering. Surgery, ICU stays, specialized medications, and the prospect of months of rehabilitation ahead. Sarah had quietly liquidated investments to cover the initial expenses, but the long-term financial implications threatened to devastate the family's resources. It was then that the community's love for Margaret manifested in ways none of them could have imagined. The morning Margaret was scheduled to begin what doctors cautiously termed recovery phase, her world collapsed with devastating finality. Dr. Harrison entered her room with an expression that had become terrifyingly familiar over the past week, the look of a physician preparing to deliver news that would shatter whatever hope remained. "The latest cultures show something we didn't expect," he began, his voice measured but unable to completely hide his own dismay. "The infection has developed resistance to our most aggressive antibiotics. What's more concerning is that it appears to be spreading internally, despite our surgical intervention." Sarah's legal pad, covered with meticulous notes about treatment plans and recovery timelines, slipped from her trembling fingers. Michael's face went ashen as he processed what the doctor wasn't quite saying, that their mother's fight might be coming to an end despite everything they had endured. Margaret herself received the news with a calmness that broke her children's hearts. At 78, she had buried a husband, survived the Great Recession's impact on their retirement savings, and faced more losses than victories in recent years. This felt like the final chapter of a story that had grown too heavy for her tired shoulders to carry. "How long?" she asked simply, her voice steady in a way that made Sarah want to scream and Michael want to punch the sterile hospital walls. Dr. Harrison's pause lasted an eternity. "Without a dramatic change in your response to treatment, we're looking at days rather than weeks." The words hung in the antiseptic air like a death sentence. Margaret nodded with the same composure she had shown when learning about Frank's terminal diagnosis, but her children saw through the facade to the frightened woman underneath who wasn't ready to leave her grandchildren, wasn't ready to stop mattering in a world that had already begun to forget her. The community's response to Margaret's deteriorating condition revealed both the depth of love surrounding her and the cruel limitations of human caring in the face of medical reality. The prayer vigils intensified, with people Margaret barely remembered showing up to hold candles and share memories of her impact on their lives. Former dance students spoke of confidence she had given them, of first dances she had choreographed, of anniversaries she had helped celebrate with graceful movements that made ordinary couples feel extraordinary. But prayers and memories couldn't fight antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Community love couldn't reverse the spread of infection through Margaret's aging body. The flowers filling her room began to feel like funeral arrangements, the constant stream of visitors like people paying their respects before it was too late. Sarah's professional composure finally cracked completely during a conference call with her law partners. "I can't lose her," she sobbed into the phone, 20 years of suppressed emotion pouring out in a Chicago hotel room where she had retreated to handle urgent business matters. "I haven't been a good daughter. I haven't visited enough, called enough, cared enough. She's going to die thinking I chose my career over her." Michael's breakdown was quieter, but no less devastating. He sat in Margaret's hospital room at 3 in the morning, holding her sleeping hand while tears streamed silently down his weathered cheeks. "I should have made her move closer after Dad died," he whispered to the darkness. "I should have insisted. She's been alone all this time because I was too busy with my own life to take care of the woman who sacrificed everything for us." The guilt that consumed both children was as destructive as the bacteria ravaging their mother's body. They took turns confessing sins of omission, missed phone calls, delayed visits, assumptions that there would always be more time for the conversations they had been postponing. Margaret listened with the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime forgiving the people she loved for being human. Margaret's grandchildren were brought to Cleveland for what everyone understood might be final goodbyes. Emma, at 7, couldn't fully grasp why Grandma looked so sick and tired, but she crawled into the hospital bed and snuggled against Margaret's side with the fearless affection that only children possess. Tommy, 9 and more aware of the gravity, sat quietly and let Margaret teach him card games their limited time together had previously prevented. Baby Jake, barely 3, toddled around the hospital room with the oblivious joy of childhood. His laughter a bittersweet reminder of all the moments Margaret might miss: first days of school, graduation ceremonies, weddings, the birth of great-grandchildren who would know her only through stories and photographs. The medical team's last-ditch effort involved experimental treatments that carried their own significant risks. The medications that might kill the resistant bacteria could also destroy Margaret's kidneys, liver, or what remained of her immune system. Dr. Harrison presented the options with clinical detachment, but his personal investment in Margaret's case was evident in the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking. "There's a new combination therapy," he explained during another family conference that felt like a negotiation with death itself. "It's shown promise in similar cases, but it's essentially chemotherapy-level toxic to the body. At Margaret's age, with her current condition, the treatment might kill her before the infection does." The decision ultimately fell to Margaret herself, and her response surprised no one who truly knew her. "I want to try," she said firmly. "Not because I'm afraid to die, but because I'm not ready to give up on living. Those babies need their grandmother, and I need to be here for them." The experimental treatment began immediately, and Margaret's body responded with a violence that terrified everyone watching. Her temperature spiked to dangerous levels, her blood pressure became erratic, and her kidneys showed signs of stress that had Dr. Harrison considering whether to continue or abort the protocol. For 48 hours, Margaret hovered between two different kinds of potential death: the slow spread of infection or the rapid toxicity of the cure. Sarah and Michael maintained their bedside vigil, taking turns reading to their semi-conscious mother from books she had loved, playing music from her ballroom dancing days, and sharing memories of their childhood that felt simultaneously precious and inadequate. The hospital room became a time capsule of Margaret Thompson's life, filled with photographs, cards, and mementos that testified to a woman who had touched more lives than she had ever realized. On the third day of the experimental treatment, Margaret stopped responding to voices, stopped opening her eyes, stopped giving any sign that she was aware of the family surrounding her bed. The machines monitoring her vital signs painted a picture of a body under siege, fighting battles on multiple fronts with resources that were rapidly depleting. Dr. Harrison pulled the family aside for what they all understood was the final conversation about Margaret's care. "Her body is shutting down," he said gently but directly. "The treatment is causing as much damage as the infection at this point. We need to talk about comfort care, about making sure she's not suffering, about letting her go peacefully." The words hit Sarah and Michael like physical blows, final confirmation that their mother's remarkable spirit was preparing to leave a world that had become too difficult for her failing body to navigate. As they stood in a sterile hospital corridor making decisions no children should have to make, neither of them could have imagined that Margaret Thompson still had one more surprise left in her story. The miracle began with a whisper that no one initially believed could be real. At 4:17 a.m. on what everyone assumed would be Margaret's final day, Nurse Patricia O'Brien noticed something that made her question her own exhausted senses. Margaret's fever, which had raged at dangerous levels for 72 hours, had dropped 2 full degrees. Her blood pressure, erratic and declining for days, had stabilized at numbers that fell within normal ranges for the first time since the experimental treatment began. "Dr. Harrison, you need to see this," Patty called, her voice carrying a note of wonder that penetrated the doctor's caffeine and adrenaline haze. He had been surviving on 30-minute naps in the on-call room, unable to leave the hospital, while his most challenging case in 3 decades hung in the balance between life and death. The lab results that came back 2 hours later defied everything Harrison thought he knew about antibiotic-resistant infections and the human body's capacity for recovery. Margaret's white blood cell count, which had been climbing toward catastrophic levels, had dropped by nearly 40% overnight. The bacterial cultures that had shown aggressive growth for over a week suddenly displayed massive die-offs that the lab technicians had to run 3 times to verify. Sarah and Michael, who had been taking shifts maintaining their bedside vigil, arrived to find their mother's room buzzing with medical activity that felt different from the frantic crisis management of recent days. Dr. Harrison stood beside Margaret's bed with an expression of professional amazement that bordered on disbelief, studying charts and test results with the intensity of a man witnessing something he had never seen before. "I don't understand what's happening," he admitted to the family, his scientific training warring with the evidence before his eyes. "By every measure we have, your mother should be dying. Instead, her body appears to be mounting the most effective immune response I've ever documented in a patient her age with this level of systemic infection." Margaret herself remained unconscious, but her breathing had deepened and steadied. Her color had improved from the gray pallor of impending death to something approaching healthy pink. The machines monitoring her vital signs hummed with readings that painted a picture of a body fighting back with unexpected strength and determination. The first sign of consciousness came when Margaret's fingers twitched in response to Sarah's voice reading from her mother's favorite poetry collection. The movement was so subtle that Sarah initially thought she had imagined it, but Michael noticed it too. A deliberate flexing that suggested Margaret was not only alive, but aware of her surroundings. "Mom?" Sarah's voice cracked with hope she was afraid to feel. "Can you hear me?" Margaret's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, but gradually sharpening as she took in the familiar faces surrounding her bed. Her first attempt to speak came out as a raspy whisper that sent both her children into tears of relief and joy. "Did I miss Thanksgiving?" she asked again, the same question that had become her signature response to medical crisis, and this time everyone in the room laughed through their tears because it was so perfectly, wonderfully Margaret. Dr. Harrison's investigation into Margaret's remarkable recovery revealed the first of several shocking truths that would transform their understanding of everything that had happened. The soil samples from the Florida property where Margaret had been gardening came back positive for multiple strains of drug-resistant bacteria, but they also contained something unexpected: naturally occurring bacteriophages that were specifically effective against the organisms that had nearly killed her. "It's like her body became a battlefield," Harrison explained to a room full of infectious disease specialists who had gathered to study Margaret's case. The initial infection was severe and resistant to our antibiotics, but her system also absorbed natural predators that eventually gained the upper hand. It's a one-in-a-million combination of circumstances. But the medical miracle was only the beginning of revelations that would reshape the Thompson family's understanding of love, sacrifice, and the hidden depths of human devotion. As Margaret grew stronger and more coherent, Sarah found the courage to confess something that had been eating at her soul for weeks. "Mom, I need to tell you something about my divorce," Sarah began, her voice shaking with emotion she had kept buried for months. "David didn't leave because he couldn't handle my career. I left him because he wanted me to put you in a nursing home after Dad died. He said you were becoming a financial liability, that we needed to protect our assets from potential medical expenses." The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. Margaret had always wondered why Sarah's marriage had ended so suddenly, why her daughter had become even more distant and work-focused in recent years. Learning that Sarah had chosen her mother's dignity over her own happiness was overwhelming in ways that medical crises had never been. Michael's confession came later that same day, delivered with the quiet intensity that characterized his approach to difficult truths. "Ma, you know how I've been working those extra shifts at the garage? How Linda's been taking on more hours at the diner?" Margaret nodded, assuming they were struggling with typical family financial pressures. "We've been saving money to buy the house next door to ours. We wanted you to move closer, but we knew you'd never accept charity. We were going to tell you it was a rental property investment, let you think you were helping us out by being our tenant." The weight of these revelations, that both her children had been reorganizing their lives around caring for her, while she believed herself to be a burden they were too polite to acknowledge, broke something open in Margaret's chest that had nothing to do with bacterial infections and everything to do with the complex geography of family love. The third shocking discovery came from an unexpected source. Elena Rodriguez appeared in Margaret's hospital room carrying a manila folder that she placed on the bedside table with ceremonial gravity. "Mia, there are some things you need to know about your community," she began, her nurse's training evident in the gentle but direct way she delivered difficult information. The folder contained documentation of something Margaret had never suspected: an informal care network that had been operating around her for years. Elena had been coordinating grocery deliveries, lawn maintenance, and home repairs through a group of neighbors, former dance students, and community members who had quietly organized themselves to support Margaret's independence without damaging her pride. "Mrs. Peterson from the grocery store, she's been marking down your regular items and having them delivered under the pretense of manager's specials," Elena explained. "Your lawn maintenance? That's not city services. That's Tom Garcia's landscaping crew working for free every other Saturday. The book club ladies have been taking turns checking on you, timing their casual visits so you're never alone for more than 2 days at a time." Margaret listened to this catalogue of secret kindnesses with tears streaming down her face, understanding for the first time that the loneliness she had felt since Frank's death was as much perception as reality. She had been surrounded by love and support, but it had been invisible to her because it came wrapped in respect for her independence rather than obvious charity. The most shocking revelation of all came from Dr. Harrison's continued investigation into the source of Margaret's infection. The contaminated soil in Florida hadn't been the result of natural bacterial evolution or agricultural runoff, as they had initially suspected. Laboratory analysis revealed the presence of medical waste that traced back to an illegal dumping operation that had been active in the 1980s and 1990s. The property where Michael's family lived, where Margaret had played with her grandchildren and sustained the minor scratch that had nearly killed her, was part of a larger environmental contamination that had been covered up by developers and ignored by local authorities for decades. Margaret's case became the key evidence in a federal investigation that ultimately led to criminal charges, environmental cleanup, and a settlement fund that would cover not only her medical expenses, but provide resources for other potential victims. Margaret's recovery continued at a pace that amazed her medical team and transformed her from a patient into a case study that would be published in medical journals and presented at conferences around the world. But for Margaret herself, the most important transformation was the recognition that she had never been as alone or as much of a burden as she had believed. As she sat in her hospital bed, surrounded by flowers from people she hadn't seen in years, reading cards from former students who still remembered the confidence she had given them on dance floors decades ago, Margaret realized that her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning a new chapter. 6 months after Margaret Thompson had been wheeled into Cleveland General's emergency room with a foot so grotesquely swollen that seasoned medical professionals questioned their own eyes, she stood in the community center where she had taught ballroom dancing for 4 decades, watching 3 generations of her family attempt to master the basic steps of a waltz. The physical transformation was remarkable enough. Margaret moved with only a slight limp that she had learned to incorporate into her teaching style, turning what could have been a limitation into a demonstration of how grace could emerge from adversity. Her silver hair was perfectly set as always, her lipstick applied with the precision of someone who understood that presentation mattered. But there was something different in her eyes now. The loneliness that had haunted them for years had been replaced by a depth of understanding about love that comes only through nearly losing everything. "No, no, Emma," Margaret laughed, gently repositioning her 7-year-old granddaughter's feet for the 10th time. "Dancing isn't about perfect steps, sweetheart. It's about moving together with someone you care about." Emma giggled and stepped on Margaret's foot again, but this time it felt like a blessing rather than a mistake. Sarah stood at the edge of the dance floor, still in her business suit but with her shoes kicked off, watching her mother with an expression that mixed wonder and gratitude in equal measure. The high-powered corporate lawyer who had once scheduled phone calls with her mother around court appearances now flew from Chicago every other weekend, bringing work that could wait and priorities that couldn't. "Your turn, counselor," Margaret called, extending her hand toward Sarah with the same encouraging smile she had used with thousands of nervous students over the years. "You can't lawyer your way through a foxtrot." The dance that followed was awkward and beautiful, full of missed steps and shared laughter that spoke to years of distance finally being closed through simple physical connection. Sarah had forgotten what it felt like to be taught something by her mother, to be the student rather than the successful professional who had all the answers. Michael's participation was more reluctant but no less meaningful. His calloused hands, permanently stained from years of automotive work, held Margaret's with a gentleness that surprised them both. "I feel ridiculous, Ma," he muttered. But he was smiling as he said it, and he didn't let go. "Your father felt ridiculous too, the first time I taught him to dance," Margaret replied, her voice carrying the warmth of memory without the sharp edge of grief that had characterized any mention of Frank for the past 8 years. He said real men don't prance around dance floors. But he learned because he knew it made me happy. That's what love looks like sometimes, being willing to look foolish for someone else's joy. The community center had been transformed for the occasion into something that felt like a celebration of survival rather than a simple family reunion. Margaret's former students had organized what they called a welcome back dance that drew people from across 3 counties. The woman who had nearly died from a mysterious infection had become something of a local legend, her story spreading through the networks of people whose lives she had touched over the decades. Dr. James Harrison arrived during the evening, still wearing his hospital scrubs but carrying a small wrapped gift that he presented to Margaret with the shy formality of a man more comfortable with medical crises than social celebrations. "I brought you something," he said, his usual professional confidence replaced by something approaching nervousness. The gift was a framed photograph. The medical team that had saved Margaret's life gathered around the empty hospital bed where she had fought her battle against death and won. On the back, in Dr. Harrison's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for reminding us why we became doctors." "You know," Harrison said, accepting a cup of punch from one of Margaret's former students, "in 30 years of emergency medicine I've saved a lot of lives, but I've never had a patient teach me as much about living as you did." The evening's most powerful moment came when Elena Rodriguez approached the microphone that had been set up for speeches and testimonials. Margaret's neighbor, the retired nurse who had recognized the severity of her condition and insisted on the hospital visit that had saved her life, spoke with the authority of someone who had seen both the worst and best of human nature. 6 months ago, Margaret thought she was alone in the world, Elena began, her voice carrying to every corner of the community center. She thought her children were too busy for her, thought her neighbors saw her as just another elderly widow taking up space. Tonight, look around this room and see the truth. Margaret Thompson has never been alone. She just couldn't see the love that surrounded her because it came dressed as everyday kindness instead of grand gestures. The settlement money from the environmental lawsuit had provided financial security that Margaret had never expected to have again, but more importantly, it had funded a foundation dedicated to elderly safety and community support. Margaret's near-death experience had exposed not just the contaminated soil that had nearly killed her, but the social contamination of isolation that threatened elderly people throughout their community. The Foundation's first initiative was a program that Elena had designed based on the informal care network that had been supporting Margaret without her knowledge. Trained volunteers now visited elderly residents, not as obvious charity workers, but as friends who happened to need help with their own groceries, who enjoyed the company for afternoon coffee, who appreciated advice about gardening or cooking or the 1,000 small skills that accumulated over a lifetime of living. Margaret's story had been featured in national news programs, medical journals, and community newsletters, but the coverage she treasured most was a simple article in the local high school newspaper written by her grandson Tommy. His essay about "My Grandmother's Medical Mystery" had won a state writing contest, but more importantly, it had captured something essential about family love that adult perspectives often missed. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests filtered out into the Ohio night, Margaret found herself alone in the community center with Sarah and Michael, the 3 of them surrounded by the detritus of celebration. Empty punch cups, scattered programs, chairs pushed back from tables where people had lingered over stories and memories. "I have something to tell you both," Margaret said, settling into one of the chairs with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned not to take physical movement for granted. "I've been thinking about selling the house." The words hit Sarah and Michael like small thunderclaps, and Margaret watched their faces cycle through surprise, concern, and the beginning of protests before she held up her hand for silence. Not because I can't take care of myself, she continued, smiling at their predictable reactions, but because I've learned something important these past 6 months. Home isn't a place where you live alone. Home is where people who love you want to be near you. And I think it's time I stopped hiding from that truth. The conversation that followed stretched into the early morning hours, three adults planning a future that honored both Margaret's independence and the family bonds that had proven stronger than anyone had imagined. By the time the sun rose over Cleveland, they had sketched the outline of a new chapter that none of them could have envisioned 6 months earlier. Margaret Thompson's story isn't just about surviving a medical crisis. It's about discovering that the love we desperately need often surrounds us in ways we can't see. At 78, Margaret believed she was invisible, forgotten by busy children and a world that had moved on without her. Sound familiar? How many of us have felt like we're becoming burdens to the people we raised, loved, and sacrificed everything for? Margaret's near-death experience revealed a stunning truth. Her children hadn't forgotten her. They had been secretly reorganizing their entire lives to care for her. Her community hadn't abandoned her. They had created an invisible network of support that preserved her dignity while meeting her needs. The loneliness that had consumed her wasn't real. It was a misperception born from pride in the quiet nature of mature love. Today, Margaret teaches dance again. Not because she recovered from flesh-eating bacteria, but because she recovered from the isolation that was killing her spirit long before any infection touched her body. Sometimes our greatest tragedy becomes our greatest gift. The wake-up call that shows us love was there all along, waiting for us to recognize it. Discussion questions. Have you ever felt invisible to your own family, only to later discover they cared more than you realized? What small acts of kindness in your community might actually be signs of deeper care and connection? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what another reader needs to hear today.